The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Welcome, Sublation Media viewers. I want to say hello to all of you who are living. Given the nature of time, it is likely that the majority of people who are going to watch this video will be watching the video after Danny Mulligan and I are both dead. So welcome from the beyond. We want to speak to you. My name is Douglas Lain. I'm the head honcho, I was the head honcho of Sublation Media. Of course, I am no more. And Danny, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So when I was alive, I was somebody that listened to Sublation Media, and I have a PhD in clinical psychology from Wayne State University. I did my clinical internship at Emory, and I'm on postdoc right now at University of Connecticut Health Center. So basically, I work as a therapist and as a researcher in developmental psychopathology, and yeah.
Oh, great. So now you watched an episode of the Sublation Magazine show that I did with, I think it was with Nina Power and Benjamin Studebaker.
Yeah.
And this was shortly after the death of my father, and I wanted to talk about Ernest Becker. And I was surprised how Studebaker rejected Becker's work, kind of dismissively.
I have a couple of thoughts. One is the strongest critique of Hobbes is always the claim that the fear of death is not as important as Hobbes thinks it is. The fear of death causes us to seek peace, and therefore causes us to come together to have commodious living. It's the fact that some people are not as scared of death as Hobbes suggests that causes that argument to not go through. And sometimes with undergraduate students, I would refer to all of mankind on a Hobbes-Gandhi scale or spectrum with regard to what degree fear should motivate us versus positive commitments to values. In the Becker book, all of the positive commitments to values are reframed as sublimated fear of death. And I have noticed that there's a tendency, and I've always thought it's a little adolescent. It's something that people tend to do when they're teenagers or in their 20s, of going, okay, I have this vice or problem or hang-up. I'm going to project it onto everybody. Mm-hmm. Everybody actually has this. So therefore, I don't have to get rid of it because it's in everybody. And since it's in everybody, anybody who claims that they don't have it or seems to not have it has just covered it up in a bunch of pride, and I can then expose them as having concealed this thing that, of course, they necessarily inevitably must have, because I have it, and I am the universal subject.
You wrote to me and suggested that maybe I could balance out that episode of Sublation Magazine by talking to you. You have studied Becker, and did you study him formally as you were getting your degree to become a therapist, or how did you encounter Ernest Becker?
Yeah, well, actually it started in my undergrad at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I think I was taking a psychodynamics psychotherapy course as a senior, and we had to do like a final project, and I did mine on terror management theory, which didn't really come up in the last episode, but basically like three social psychologists read Becker's work and then formalized part of it into terror management theory and social psychology. So they have done about like 30 to 40 years of academic research on it, testing hypotheses that they got from Becker's work and found a lot of support for it. So anyways, that's where I first found it. And so I did a presentation on it, thought it was really interesting, the role of death in life and death anxiety and death denial in our culture. And then, I didn't really do much with it, but then I ended up reading the books. So I read Denial of Death maybe like a year later or something on my own. And I just began slowly studying Becker's work on my own. And then didn't really do much with it until my dissertation. And I worked Becker into my dissertation. It wasn't like a central focus, but one of the main variables I looked into when I was alive was social status. So I used Becker's work on social status as heroism and how it's linked to the denial of death to sort of come up with a measure and come up with a way of interpreting the relation between social status, social inequality, and then mental health outcomes.
What was the name of those sociologists or social psychologists who created terror management theory? Do you remember?
Yep, it's Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Brzezinski, I think.
The first one, Sheldon Solomon, I interviewed him years ago.
Okay.
So he's an affable fellow. I enjoyed talking to him. But one of the things that I decided after interviewing him was that terror management theory seemed to be kind of by formalizing Becker and by trying to create something that could be empirical and that could be implemented to deal with social problems. It seemed to me to be I just thought it fit well within the liberal progressive state aims, and that it ultimately there was something that it couldn't address, which was mainly the primary problem of the fear of death, and the way our society creates hero systems. That this was a reformist at best move to try to ameliorate or mediate the conflicts through therapeutic means, and I just felt that it was at the time I would have said it was just a liberal project, but I think I would say it was progressive now instead. But nonetheless, he was a serious scholar and follower of Becker, and one of the people who kept Becker's ideas not just alive but relevant, I guess, within social psychology.
Yeah, I'd say he's the number one. And they wrote a book too. It's a good book. It's called Worm at the Core, The Role of Death in Life. I think something like that is the subtitle. But yeah, I share your view, but a little bit, I see it a little bit differently. But yeah, I agree. I think Sheldon Solomon's great. I've never met him, but I emailed with him a little bit, and he's on a bunch of podcasts, so people can check him out. I'll probably check out yours with him. But I think that it's more so, in my experience, it's sort of the way that Sheldon and maybe some of the other guys relate terror management theory to contemporary culture and to politics in a progressive or liberal way. I don't know if the actual empirical studies that are out there necessarily lend themselves to that. They're really just testing the mortality salience hypothesis that basically, cultural worldviews, which are like heroic immortality ideologies, have the function of alleviating, denying, repressing death anxiety. And so then if you challenge those core tenets of that ideology, it awakens death thoughts, death anxiety in people. They also do a lot of other interesting things related to the body, because we'll get into this, but for Becker and really out throughout the denial of death, he links the body and creatureliness to mortality. And so they do other things with priming people with handling talking about menstruation or like handling like tampons and things like that, and apparently that awakened death anxiety in their subjects.
Men and women.
I think so, yeah. And I heard Sheldon talk about that. I didn't actually read the study, but anyways, yeah. But I think that you're right in the sense that the way it's talked about, like, I guess online, has been in a liberal or progressive way. And I don't think that's necessarily what Becker is doing in the book. And so I think he's pretty critical of, he's definitely critical of capitalism. I don't know exactly how we classify him. We can get into it, but I mean, I think that he's more or less in line with the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School.
Okay, that's interesting, and we'll get to that. But before we go in that direction, I guess I want to just outline Becker's approach to understanding both human psychology and social psychology in terms of death, and raise at the outset what I think was Benjamin Studebaker's objection. Studebaker seemed to cast Becker as some kind of, I would say, moral nihilist or an egotist, in so much as he thought that Becker was claiming that transhistorically human beings have been self-interested, maybe even quasi-narcissistic, and therefore, because of that, unable to accept their own mortality. And that, now I'm paraphrasing here, and this is like, I'm translating through my own understanding. Not, this isn't Studebaker's exact words, but he claimed or accused Becker of projecting his own neurotic attachment to his life onto all of history and onto society. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to, one, explain what where Becker thought death anxiety arose from. Why was that a fact about human existence? And two, maybe address those objections from Studebaker, if you could.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll add to that. So I think that that's in line with how I remember the discussion. But yeah, what struck me was he was extremely dismissive of Becker in that way. And he was also painting him as somebody, I think he said something like Becker's a person who says that death or death anxiety explains all human problems throughout human history, that there's basically this monocausal hypothesis that it's the single cause of, all civilizational level problems in every single historical period. And that's just absolutely not the case. And it sounded like you're sort of responding to somebody that would be making like a grandiose argument on social media using like large binary abstract categories and sort of like dismissing that person on that basis. But that's not at all how Becker positions it. And it's actually, so you can see it's in the preface of the book of Denial of Death. I was just going back and revisiting it. It's like the second sentence in the preface. He says something like, death, the terror of death is a mainspring of human activity. So he's not saying it's the mainspring or the only cause of human activity. He says it's a mainspring. It's one primary driver. So I think right there in the preface, you see. And then in the chapter 2 on the terror of death, he says something similar at the very beginning of the chapter. I had it marked here. He says, here we introduce directly one of the great rediscoveries of modern thought, that of all things that move man, one of the principal ones is his terror of death.
It is customary to link the development of psychology to the rise of the bourgeois individual. One should not overlook the contrary moment. If all psychology since Protagoras elevated human beings by thinking of them as the measure of all things, then it has also simultaneously and from the very beginning turn the latter into objects, analytic material, and consign them, once they are lined up as things, to nullity.
There is an inexorable force in the cosmos where time and space converge. A place beyond man's vision, but not his reach. It is the most mysterious and awesome point in the universe, where the here and now may be forever.
On my ship, you ask.
It is unavoidable. Moving through space, swallowing everything in its path. Radio waves, light.
Are you programmed to speak?
Even planets and stars. Now,
Gravity's at maximum, Dan.
my God, I think it's got us. Man is about to enter
We've got a break here too!
the black hole.
Death is a complex symbol and not any particular, sharply defined thing to a child. Quote, "The child's concept of death is not a single thing, but it is rather a composite of mutually contradictory paradoxes. Death itself is not only a state, but a complex symbol. Terror of the world, the horror of one's own wishes, the fear of vengeance by the parents, the disappearance of things, one's lack of control over anything, really."
Psychotechnics is no mere decayed form of psychology, but immanent in its principle. This becomes flagrant in psychoanalysis. It confiscates the personality as a lifelong lie. Precisely by proving such, however, it simultaneously confirms to human beings their own non-existence. It alienates them from themselves, denouncing their autonomy along with their unity and subjecting them completely to the mechanism of rationalization, that of adjustment. In the end, the wisdom of psychoanalysis truly becomes what the fascist unconscious of the tabloid magazines considers it to be. Suggestion and hypnosis return in their grandiose system once again. The ones who help because they know better turn into the ones who humiliate others through bossy privilege. What remains of the critique of the bourgeois consciousness is only that shrugging of the shoulders by which all doctors have announced their secret complicity with death. In psychology, in the boundless fraud of what is merely interiorized, is reflected what the organization of bourgeois society has since time immemorial practiced on external property. The individual person is thereby on loan, as it were, from its class, and those who are its functionaries are ready to take it back as soon as generalized property endangers its principle, which consists precisely of withholding.
If he's anything, he's an Enlightenment thinker who's trying to carry on the project of enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And what he's saying is that that project, has dissipated, has broken apart. Social science began with this sort of promise. He really highlights Rousseau and Marx, for example, as major figures. But when he's talking about the state of academia, basically every single scientist like him is focused on like one very specialized problem within their discipline. The disciplines don't really talk with each other. He says like scientists are drowning in facts. There's mountains of empirical data. Nobody knows what it all adds up to, what it all means. He says something like they're mired in data and devoted to triviality, social scientists. And so what he's saying is that in this state where there's really no generalists, and there's nobody that's carrying on the project of enlightenment, where you have to sort of think interdisciplinary, you have to synthesize in a way that like a Marx did, for example. He's saying, well, I'm going to risk, playing the fool and maybe overstating some things in order to emphasize what I think are some big ideas that are of great importance for understanding the problem of human evil, for understanding the problem of aggression, inequality, conflict, and things like that. So I don't know if you asked a bunch of different things.
Yeah,
but.
I did ask a bunch of different things. You're doing a good job of answering them. Let me see if I can play the part of Benjamin Studebaker, devil's advocate, and I'm not sure that I'll be doing a good job. But there's a claim that Becker is reductionist and centralizes the problem of death as fundamental to human experience and human society, and claims that is a central cause of social problems and human suffering. Right? There's that claim, which you say he does not quite do. That he maybe emphasizes it, considers it primary or one of the primary drivers of human activity, not just human activity that causes problems, but also what we might consider to be the most noble actions that humans can do. But also, there's another way to deny Becker or to dismiss Becker, which is to say, not that there is no empirical evidence for death anxiety, but rather that the problem of death anxiety is itself a symptom of some other failure or social ill or moral failure within society and people. So I think that might also be where Studebaker is coming from. I know we've been talking about how he's a Platonist, which I admire, right? I remember Plato. I read some Plato when I was in college.
It's important, very important thinker.
Yeah, he's a big dude. He's not to be sneezed at. So I think Studebaker might say, if you align your life and the projects that you take up with care towards the good, then the problem of death will evaporate because your own individual egoistic needs or desires will fade as you align yourself with the good as such, perhaps then on a one level down with social good or what's good for a community or that kind of thing. So, and also, I think from my perspective, that could also be a claim that the way in which our society has become secularized has led to this problem of death, and that in communities where the God or the good is taken up as central and the significant mediator of social relations, then the problem of death isn't so pressing. What would you make of that objection?
I think Becker completely agrees with that, and that's one of his central concerns is the problem of modernization. The death of God, the rise of industrial capitalism. So alienation is a central category for him. It doesn't come up as much in the denial of death, but it really comes out in, he has a book, Beyond Alienation, which is about the crisis of education, it's a philosophy of education for the crisis of democracy. And he's proposing a whole new way of doing university level education, which is dedicated to understanding the problem of human alienation in history, in society, at individual level, at collective level. And so, yeah, he is saying that the problem of death exists all throughout human history, and that it's a part of human nature, and that it's inescapably a part of human nature. So he would say that. And I think that's on firm ground. Like, I think if science understands anything, it's probably through, Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection and sexual selection. And we know that all living things have the self-preservation instinct, and there's the imperative to pass on your genes to maximize the number of genes that get passed on to the next generation, for example. And it's just common sense that, all people are disinclined to die and are and do all sorts of things to mitigate death and death anxiety. But yeah, he would say that it varies throughout history to the degree to which it's a problem. He's centrally concerned with what, and this kind of gets to the issue of religion that you brought up, which I was wanting to address at some point too, because I think you said in the first podcast that Becker kind of turns to Christianity in the end of the denial of death. Mm-hmm. And I think there's an element of truth to that, but I would say it's more of sort of existentialism or existential spirituality with maybe a Christian flavoring to it. But he's concerned with the issue of what's the ideal heroism, which I think in his mind would mitigate the problem of death anxiety, death denial. He's constantly sort of asking, what's the most kind of creative and generative myth that my cat is coming up here that leads to minimal destructiveness. And so, for example, he talks about, in the current era of consumer capitalism, I think he uses that term a lot, consumer or laissez-faire capitalism, that it's the most destructive immortality ideology that's ever existed, and that it's going to destroy the planet.
Sorry, I'm a little distracted by your cat, but it's not a bad thing. I used to have the same problem whenever I would start talking on a podcast. My cat thought maybe I was lonely or I needed, like, what's wrong with my human? I have to go and comfort them. Okay, so just to step back, let me see if I can stop thinking about your cat and return to the topic. So it's always struck me that once you accept that our immortality projects, whether they're religious or artistic or hedonistic or what have you, or political, that these immortality projects are a way to stave off and protect oneself from the truth of our own mortality and our finitude and the anxiety that comes with knowing that you are going to be dead. That move just forecloses the possibility of embracing an immortality project that will actually do the job. You have to sort of close off part of your mind to re-embrace something that had seemed maybe like an answer in the face of your decision that it is not. In other words, if you believe in God and an afterlife, then the problem of mortality is solved. You may have a fear of pain, a fear of the unknown, perhaps, but not a fear of the nothingness of death that defines it. Death today. Death was taken up as a part of life in the past. There were stories about what happens after. There were all sorts of rituals, and we might let ourselves believe that the people who were in communities founded on religious organizing, religion organizing society, believed in an afterlife. They believed in their immortality, and therefore, so now our immortality projects, our attempts at heroism, are always undercut, are always going to be partial. And so that existential quality that you mentioned, that kind of Christianity that isn't fundamentalist or literal, but that Becker embraces, is, I think, a way to try to solve that problem. Zizek talks about Christian atheism. There's that death of God theology. I think all of that.
Hegelian interpretation.
Yeah. Right. Even Hegel might be, trying to thread the needle here or split the difference. So how do you see Becker's? I mean, I'm jumping to the end maybe too soon, but do you believe that Becker's solutions that he offers up in the denial of death overcome the problem that I'm trying to point out?
So he doesn't really offer that many solutions in either book. So he's more, I think, trying to understand the problems, and I think that's valuable. And I do think that he makes valuable contributions to people, to social theory, and people who are interested in Freudian Marxism, more or less. And that is his ultimate project.
Fame, which had something accidental and stagey about it, and yet also a glimmer of justice and free choice, has been liquidated as a result of the objective processes of the market society. It has entirely become a function of paid propaganda bureaus, and is measured in terms of the investment being wagered by the name bearer or interest group which stands behind it. One takes control of the process of becoming famous, and thereby, to a certain degree, also their afterlife, for what has a chance of being remembered in a thoroughly organized society which is not already familiar, and purchases the expectation of immortality only no longer from the church, but henceforth from the lackeys of trusts. But there is no blessing therein. Just as capricious memory and utter oblivion always went together, so too does the planned disposition of fame and memorialization lead irresistibly into nothingness. The famous are not happy. They turn themselves into brand name articles, alien and incomprehensible to themselves. As living pictures of themselves, they are like the dead. In the pretentious concern for their aura, they waste the substantive energy, which alone is capable of perpetuation. The inhuman indifference and contempt which is immediately meted out to the fallen giants of the culture industry reveals the truth about their fame, without giving those who partake in scorning that fame any better hope for posterity. Thus, intellectuals discover the frailty of their secret motives, and the only help against such is to express this insight.
Tell me about the denial of death in terms of how it was a critique of Freud. I mean, isn't it primarily or largely a critique of Freud, or maybe an eminent critique of psychoanalysis and psychological solutions for human problems in general?
Yes. Yeah, I think he says something like bringing a closure of psychoanalysis on Kierkegaard, using primarily Otto Rank, and Norman O. Brown. They're two very influential figures for him. But yeah, it's sort of making psychoanalysis existential, I would say. Yeah. So, and by the way, yeah, I also, encountered it in my 20s, and it was similar. And I think that, I encourage people to read it for that reason. It really, this is the other thing of like the way that, the problem was sort of dismissed in the first podcast. It was like, all sorts of philosophers have said, death is like the muse of philosophy, right? Or isn't it Camus or Sartre that says something like the only real philosophical problem is whether or not you should kill yourself?
I think that was Camus, I believe, who said that. Yeah.
Yeah. Philosophy is about learning how to die. Cornel West says that a lot. It's incredibly powerful on an individual level to reflect on your mortality, and it helps you, realize that we don't have much time left. The life is incredibly short, and every decision you make, every action you make is super consequential. It makes me think also of like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence idea. Like, I think of it not literally, but just as a thought experiment. Like, would I do this podcast? If I had to do it over again, an infinite number of times.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives like sort of infinite importance to every moment.
I always remember what Woody Allen said about that idea. He said, "Well, that would mean I'd have to sit through the Ice Capades again." But anyhow, I think what is often lost, again, just to return to Denial of Death as the book, is how he is attempting to resolve and the loose ends of psychoanalysis to correct some of the errors or misunderstandings that he sees in people like Otto Rank and Fromm. Am I remembering correctly?
Your Fromm comes up and I wouldn't say he's central, but yeah.
Yeah. Basically the optimism behind psychoanalysis, especially the followers of Freud, is something that Becker's attempting to mitigate against, to warn us off of. Is that, am I remembering correctly there?
Yeah, well, I think that's where he gets into really. I think you're picking up on the Norman O. Brown and
right.
And I think Norman O. Brown was a major influence on the New Left, and same with Marcuse. Obviously, he brings up Marcuse as well, and he's critical of them. So basically, there was this new wave of Freudian interpreters in the New Left era who were thinking basically like, and this is kind of at the beginning of like the triumph of the therapeutic, but interestingly also the decline of psychoanalysis after this period. So, but anyways, there was sort of an idea that human beings could learn to undo repression. So not just the repressed fear of death, but just in general through psychoanalysis, could liberate themselves psychologically to no longer be repressed. And so I think Norman O. Brown has an idea of like a rebirth in a second innocence, and this triumph of Eros, of the erotic life force sort of being unleashed from people, sexual freedom, but also freedom from all sorts of cultural, constrictions on the personality and on social relations. I think this sort of gets into the problems of like, sort of individualistic approaches to, liberal politics, authenticity, expressiveness, right, and sort of what was the Age of Aquarius, sort of that sort of the drug use, the hippie aspect of the New Left in the 60s. He's critical of all of that. And saying that, basically people repress themselves of necessity because of the problem of death, and that it will never go away. And so all of that is impossible. And that, like psychology, he says, like psychology as such is not going to solve these problems that people are concerned with. So he's talking about the limits of psychoanalysis or psychology as such.
Right. So you might imagine that you can overcome your edible complex or the trauma that you experienced as a child or whenever, maybe as a soldier, that you could unpack the ways in which you're unconsciously repeating old traumas and lay that all out on the table through analysis or some sort of therapeutic process, and then be in a position to be free, to be emancipated from the repression of your libidinal desires, but rather have an ego that can properly sublimate and without feeling overwhelmed, and that our ego could be up to the task of coping with our unconscious desires. And however, Becker says, when you bring death anxiety into the picture, you find something that is existential, that basically is innate and
cannot be overcome simply by understanding it, or by going through, like you said, an analytic process of self-discovery, right? So
Yep.
that's, yeah.
Yeah, and I think now this would be a good time to get at the argument, because this was another thing that I think in the first podcast, and when we've been talking about it now, somebody who hasn't read the book and maybe is just hearing things like death anxiety, death denial, heroism, they're sort of like a common usage meaning of those words, but the way that he develops it is it's in the language of depth psychology, basically. And so one thing I want to say about the problem of death, it's not just that human beings are aware of their own mortality and acutely aware of it. It's also that because of that, so we're also aware that we could die at any time, and there's a total lack of control, there's total unpredictability. He goes through all sorts of examples of in modern life, just the kind of horrific or stupid accidental ways that people can just be obliterated, and everything that they ever wanted to do with their life is gone. That you have to say goodbye to everybody you love, there's no control that you have, and that this then introduces secondary problems, which we might call like existential concerns. So it's not just simply that we're going to die and that we're afraid of it, but then it introduces all the problems of meaninglessness, nihilism, impotence, finitude, existential concerns. And so the other thing is that it's a developmental process. So he links it. I'm glad you mentioned the Oedipal complex. So when he uses Norman O'Brown to reinterpret this aspect of Freudian theory, and I think in a way that I find very persuasive, and it's interpreting it in an existential way, in a symbolic way, where he replaces the notion of Oedipal Oedipus complex with a Oedipal project, and then ends up calling it the causa sui project, which means the project of being the cause of yourself, to bring yourself into being, to be the father of yourself, if you're going to gender it in a masculine way. And so what he talks about is that it's not so much, let me restart. The problem that the children confront is the problem of the body first. And he develops this existential dualism throughout the book, this split, sort of like the mind-body problem, right? We have consciousness, our mind, and then we have our physical body that's part of the natural world. And he talks about the split. He develops this in a bunch of different ways. So like infinitude. So the mind is infinite, the body is finite. The mind is godlike, can even create gods through mythologies. And the body is worm-like. He likes to bring in shocking phrases like, we are gods with anuses, or we are worm gods, things like that. He also maps it onto possibility versus necessity, or possibility and determinism. And so all things that are of the body are of death. And what he talks about is that like childhood through adolescence and becoming adult is this really difficult process where children basically begin with the body as the causa sui project, that the body is their vehicle for immortality. And what leads them along and allows them to feel this is the sense of self-esteem. So this is the other like big thing in Becker's framework, which isn't tied in with heroism. So he says like the primary psychological need of human beings is to have self-esteem and to maintain it. And then this is socially created and socially maintained. And so that's where the heroism comes in, that people get their sense of being good from the socially constructed and maintained notion of good, which also brings into the problem, or the development of the superego. So implanting the conscience in children through parental authority. And so anyways, what he talks about basically is that children come to realize that their body is not going to be the source of feeling good, of feeling powerful, of feeling infinite, that they have to be indoctrinated into the cultural symbolic world, which is like very strange and very challenging. And so the body as a cause of sweet project fails. And so then it becomes a cultural cause of sweet project linked to your symbolic self, the relationship between your ego and your self-concept, your symbolic self, and the cultural symbols that you have available to you. And this is always in the context of authority too. So at first, children are contending with their parents or their caregivers, and they've got the peer world, teachers, and then eventually, they have relationships to cultures, to religions, to political ideologies. And so their sense of who they are, their sense of being a good person, and therefore qualifying for immortality, is maintained by the cultural fictions. So he uses the term fictions or illusions, which gives it like a cynical view. And that's where he's often criticized. It's a very depressing and dark book where he's just talking about we need to lie to ourselves all the time, and we have to live with illusions. But I think he's actually playing with that. So he goes back and forth between being sort of cynical and polemical and sort of complaining almost, to being almost defeatist, tragic. But then he also has these moments of talking about that it's not so much illusion as a creative fiction. And this is what mythologies are. This is what stories are. It's that human beings have to co-create the meaning in their lives. And that's what culture is it's a drama that people create together. And even if it's not created by a God, it's just created by human beings. If it is something that gives people meaning and that they can be absorbed in, and they can be dedicated to a heroic project that really is heroic and isn't destructive and brings about something like socialism, for example, that the problem of death is going to be not eliminated, but it's going to be minimized. There's a bunch of other things I was going to bring up, but I know I said a lot there. So I can't.
No, yeah. Let me see if I can step back and just, elucidate or elaborate on one point that you made, which is at the beginning of a child's life, their own body is their project. The development of the power of their body and the hope for immortality through the body.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned the pleasure principle, basically. So the Freudian idea of following the pleasure principle, that's the source of sustenance, the good feeling.
So what ages are we talking about here? Like from infancy into toddlerhood, or when does that fail?
So I'm not sure exactly. I don't think Becker gets too in depth. So in Freudian theory, a lot of times talk about the first 5 years of life, and he talks about when children become aware of mortality. I think he says, and I've actually never studied this, but I think he said there was research at the time that was like 3 or 4 years old.
Yeah, 3 was about the time that I became aware of my own mortality. There's a family myth for me. I may have mentioned it on the podcast before, but when I turned 3, I cried at my birthday party because I realized, that it was a runaway process. That next would be 4, and then one day I would be 30, which was the age my father was afraid of becoming. He was, in his late 20s at the time, I recognized that there was something about my life which was out of my control, which was the passage of time and the changes that would occur to me through that. I mean, I didn't articulate it quite like that, but I recall that I did cry at my 3rd birthday, and that I was actually visiting my grandparents at the time, and my grandfather became extremely angry at me and at my father.
Oh,
like, and he was ill. He was going to die in about 3 years' time. He was on his way out already. He was diabetic, and so that was a formative moment and a myth about, a family myth about me and my father. So, and then, throughout my childhood, the concerns about death were pretty profound, I would say, as a young person, all the way through elementary school. It seems to me, like, from my own personal experience, that all seems true, right?
I'm glad you shared that. You sound like he talks about the child as philosopher in the book.
Oh, really?
Children are, naturally philosophers, and that, like, the answers that parents give them don't really satisfy what they really want to know, because they sort of are in tune with, well, he talks about also, we haven't touched on, like, the existential awe. So he gets this from Kierkegaard. There's, like, another dualism of existential awe and existential dread. And that's one of the other confusing things that I forgot to mention this with all these dualisms. He's basically saying that they can't be resolved by the child, this discontinuity between awe and dread, or between the infinite mind and the finite body. And so that's sort of also what you were contending with potentially. And so that those experiences of being just overwhelmed by, like, the awesomeness of, the sun, or certain powerful figures in your life. Like he talks about how children, you see certain faces. Like, I remember, a certain teacher at school that was just, like, totally terrifying, and probably was just a normal guy, but just something about his face, we were all terrified of him. So there's this overwhelmingness of experience that they can't quite make sense of. And anyways,
when I was about 5 or 6, I went to the Natural History Museum in Denver, Colorado, and watched a film about black holes. And after that, I was concerned about all of life being absorbed into a black hole sometime. I went to my parents and said, if there were a black hole that was coming, could you do something about it? And they're like, no, we couldn't do anything about that. And that was unsettling to realize there was such a huge force in the universe, such a destructive force, that all the adults together could do nothing about it. There will be no movie about, although, around that time, Disney put out a movie called The Black Hole, and in it, the people traveled through the black hole to, and were fine. But so there's a fantasy there. But yeah, the realization of the precarity of life, and also I think the way I realized that all the symbolic structures of authority were finite. That occurred around the age of 5 or 6, I think, for me.
Oh wow, okay, that's pretty precocious.
I guess so. Well, I was just being exposed to these stories, like about black holes, for instance.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that was, I think, the message that was being delivered by that movie, as much as it was about just, the data and the interesting facts about these black holes. It was also describing a myth about reality in the universe, a secular myth about reality in the universe, which is that, it's enormous and beyond our control and filled with destruction and ultimately meaningless. Have you ever, anyway, there's a scene in Rebel Without a Cause, this movie from the 50s with James Dean, where they go to the planetarium, and the plot is happening amongst the students, and they're like having their little social dramas. But in the background, there's a lecturer who's giving a speech about how ultimately the universe will end and mankind will be completely obliterated, and all of our lives will end up being sound and fury, indicating nothing, and it will be as if we never existed, and things like that. So, And of course, that was during the time of the atom bomb and fears of nuclear annihilation, I think. But anyhow, my point is only to say that that from within the story of my own life, and then I think the history of modernity, or the 20th and now 21st century, these ideas have some resonance there. It does seem to be fundamental, maybe more so in the 70s than now. I'm not sure. But let me ask you, when did you first encounter your own denial of death or your own death anxiety?
That's a good question. I think it was when I don't have actually very clear memories of very young, but I do remember when my grandfathers died, and I think I was like in first grade, and I just remember I drew a bunch of pictures of him like in the ground, like in his grave, and I like at school, and the teacher was like concerned about this. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think it was around that time, but I don't have like a clear memory of like,
Did you go to his funeral? Did you see him, the casket lowered into the ground when you were?
I don't think so. No. I think it was me, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I did. I don't have memories of the actual funeral.
Right. So maybe it was like television images and that you were connecting to the death of your grandfather, something like that. Well, how was that resolved? Did your parents talk to your teacher, or how did their concern get expressed?
I don't know. It didn't end up being a big deal. Yeah, they just talked about it. I don't really know, but I moved on.
Yeah. Well, in any case, not to dwell too much on the personal, the point, I guess, is just that we can both look back on our childhoods and see there's some truth to what Becker is talking about.
Pizza Time Theater presents the most incredible pizza place in the world!
Intellectuals, and especially those inclined to philosophy, are cut off from material praxis. Disgust for it drove them to deal with so-called intellectual things. But material praxis is not only the prerequisite of their own existence, but also rests on the basis of the world, with whose critique their labor coincides. If they know nothing of the basis, then they end up in the void. They stand before the choice of being informed or of turning their backs on what they detest. If they inform themselves, they do violence to themselves, thinking against their impulses, and, on top of everything else, are in danger of becoming as sordid as what they are dealing with. For the economy is no joke, and whoever wishes even to understand it must think economically.
Come on in to Pizza Time Theater. Pizza's never been so much fun.
If they, however, do not involve themselves, they apostatize their spirit, which was above all formed on economic reality, on the abstract exchange relation, as something absolute, while this latter could become spirit solely in the sensibility of its own conditionality. The intellectual is thereby seduced into vainly and disconnectedly substituting the reflex for the thing. The isolation of the spirit from business helps the intellectual business to become a comfortable ideology. Whatever intellectuals do is wrong. They experience drastically as a life and death issue the ignominious alternative, which late capitalism secretly poses to all its members, to become just another adult or to remain a child.
I really want to emphasize this self-esteem maintenance principle. So self-esteem gets like a bad rap, and deservedly so, because of the whole self-esteem movement that was like completely in like I think it was started in the 90s.
80s, I think. I think it started in the 80s. I remember being taken while I was in junior high or a freshman in high school, actually, to an assembly where we were made to watch a film on self-esteem. And that would have been like 86, 87. So, yeah. It's been around.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was a big like pop psychology movement. It became very influential in schools. I think it's related to all sorts of things of like, we should give all kids participation trophies, and it's mean to say that there, some people win competitions and we're all winners, and sort of like mantras, just saying good things about yourself, and it was all pseudoscientific. There's good like research on that like even the psychologists at the time didn't, I think, agree with how it was being used in pop culture, and the measures that people used to measure self-esteem were not valid or reliable. I think Scott Lilienfeld, he's like a skeptic psychologist. He passed away recently, but he wrote a book, I think, on this in an article. Anyways, because of that, I think self-esteem here could be called into question, but Becker's definition, I think, is a good one. And again, it's related to, I think, Freudian theory. What he says it is basically the belief and feeling with it that you are a person of value in a world of meaning. And that's what it is. And so it's provided to you by the cultural heroic project. And so it has to be socially validated. And again, it gives a sense of purpose and meaning which, human beings need in order to, move forward in the world, which, means that there has to be values. Values is, we get values from culture, but of course culture is then conditioned by the material conditions, by the economic system and all that. So it's complicated, but, any decision implies that you've used some sort of normative framework to decide to do one thing rather than another, or to pursue one goal rather than another. But yeah, anyways, so the centrality of self-esteem. What was I going to say about that?
Well, you pointed out that self-esteem was the belief or the feeling that you were a person of value in a world of meaning. Right.
Yeah.
And that film about the black hole sort of puts a hole in both of those concepts. So it can be self-annihilating to confront the reality of the destructive character and the random character of the universe. The black hole is just like an enormous example, but you pointed out at the beginning just the fact that, I could walk out the door and get hit by a bus or fall down the stairs. And that would be the end of me in a kind of a moment of a meaningless accident.
Right. Yeah. And okay, I remember what I was going to say too was that I think there's really good research on social status, a particular understanding of social status now, which is related to prestige hierarchies, which again is basically comes down to the social recognition of your importance, your worth socially. And I think Becker's notion of self-esteem is more related to that notion of social status. And anyways, when you think about that, I think it's very clear when you interact with people that there's just this baseline need for all people, basically at all times, to believe that they're good. And it's brings intense shame to be publicly judged, humiliated, or berated by your parents, your teachers, your peer group, to be rejected. So and Freud kind of gets at this with the superego, and that the parents and civilization have like ultimate control over the child because they're so vulnerable, because they need to feel good, and they're the ones that create the conditions under which children are allowed to feel good about themselves, which is sort of how the superego gets implanted, and then people censor and criticize themselves through the voice of authority figures, parents, and then cultural authorities. And so I think that is important when understanding again the problem of death, because again, like you said, black hole, or you encounter another culture, maybe you're religious, you read some philosophy, you start to doubt the existence of God, or you believe in liberalism, and then you read critiques of liberalism, you read critical theory, or and you have any sort of ideology that gives you that sense that you are a person of value in a world of meaning, and now it's undermined because you see that maybe it doesn't make sense anymore. That's what brings up the repressed death anxiety. And again, I don't even think that death anxiety is the best word for it. It doesn't really capture it. He talks about death as a complex symbol in the beginning when he talks about the terror of death. And so I think that's another thing that wasn't present in the first podcast, that I guess I already mentioned this before a little bit, but it's not just like, oh, I'm going to die, but it's, problem of meaninglessness, problem of existential aloneness, problem of humiliation, low self-esteem, demoralization, right? And you get that like culturally, when culture starts to the heroic immortality ideology starts to fade, starts to be not believable. You get anomie, normlessness, you get social disintegration, atomization, I think the things that we're going through, and Becker talks about that a lot.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've almost talked. We've talked for a little over an hour, so I just want to ask you one last question for this half, and then we can go to the Parrot Room, and I'll send you another link. But in my conversations with Chris Catrone, he'll often say that, he's a follower after Adorno, and Adorno said that there's no right life in a world gone wrong, or something like that, right? And Catrone will say, I don't expect to achieve socialism in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And which also means that, and also that the revolution isn't guaranteed. And from a Marxist perspective, these things, the revolution, socialism, they are the good. They are what will validate you, give you a way to feel you are good in a world of meaning, when you struggle for that. But with socialism, that meaning is always deferred. The world as we know it now is alienated, contradictory, not the final good, and to one's relationship to it and status within it are not what ultimately can be the ground for your self-esteem. If you're a socialist, rather you are in service of something beyond this moment. There's a kind of self-sacrifice involved in being a socialist. So does Becker address that aspect of Marxist thought, or the struggle, or political struggle, or the struggle for change? And how can one maintain self-esteem when one isn't quite sure what the good will ultimately be? Because socialism is sort of an empty signifier in terms of the specifics or the cultural values that might emerge when we're truly free.
Yes. Okay. I love that you said that, because that's exactly where my mind was going, and that's why I wanted to. One of the main motivations for talking to you. So I love that we're on the same page with that, because there's a lot to say there. He doesn't get into it too much, but I think that this is the main value of Becker's work for the left today, for socialists today, and why I think that he should be read and not roundly dismissed. So the thing that he does say, so let me just kind of frame him kind of historically. He says in Escape from Evil, I think he says that the Frankfurt School for Social Research is the leading school of sociology. So, he thinks that. He's critical of Stalin and Mao, and, his talk and critical of vulgar Marxism. And he's also critical of capitalism, consumerism, things like that. And so he's trying to understand, what's the future of something like a mature, he calls it like a mature historical Marxism, or a updated social theory. How does his work on death denial and then the stuff in Escape from Evil, which we can get to, which like centrally involves scapegoating, the psychology of scapegoating. How does that relate to what you discussed, which is basically what project are we working towards? What's the ideal heroism? What's the socialism we want to build, which would be tied to our notion of the good, because otherwise why would we be pursuing it? And he says, I think it's just a very simple thing, but he says like social theory is going to have to progress much more slowly than Marxists ever realized, or most Marxists have said. And so I think that I interpret that as consonant with what you said. But I don't think that he has, the deep historical understanding of Marxism and socialism that Catrone has, for example. When you read Chris's book, the Marxist Politics,
which we published, yeah.
I bought it. I read it. It was great. So he doesn't get in that, but I think we can apply his ideas, and I think that could be a productive conversation.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, we'll have more of that conversation in the Parrot Room, and thank you for turning up today. I'm going to close this out with let's see if I can find the right. Here we go. So I'm going to close it with the proper outro for Diet Soap. And thanks again, Danny. I'll see you on the other side,
Right.
whether it exists or not. And all to all the living people out there, it was nice talking to you from beyond the grave. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.